Jump at shadows in the dark. Don't trust what you cannot see. Touch your skin and call your name. It's just the past that looks back at me. Left your home just to get away, but you took the buses with you. Set things up just to break them down. Keeps your mind down, nothing new. There's no inspiration. Media actually does. Gone up and saviors. Government hunts them down. There's no inspiration. Media actually does. Gone up and saviors. Government hunts them down. Yeah. All that's left for you to see is a reflection of myself. All that I've been for, been taken by someone else. Taken by someone else. Taken. Yeah. Watch out for TV, how I'm dope. My knives are Lucy reruns. Talk shows open, current hit. Sanctioned self-indulgent numb. Throw away what you got. Blame what's missing from your life. It's not your fault things worked out this way. It's someone's mother, daughter, wife. There's no inspiration. Media actually does. Gone on saviors. Government hunts them down. There's no inspiration. Media actually does. Gone on saviors. Government hunts them down. Yeah. All that's left for you to see is a reflection of myself. All that I've been taken by someone else. Taken by someone else. Taken. Yeah.
All right, all right. That was Reflection by Ringmaster, Gloria's old band. Hello, everybody. I am Jayme CheeseSlice. I am the engineer and producer of Left on Left. Welcome to the show today. We're going to be talking about the RFK Sr. assassination plot. And without any further ado, let's go ahead and bring on Gloria and Jeremy. Gloria, how you doing? And Jeremy, there you go.
Hey, Jayme, good to see you.
So
And
you guys are
Jeremy.
you guys are going to be talking for an hour about Jeremy's article that he wrote on this RFK Sr. assassination. And we're going to record that for the radio for WBAI in New York, and as well as the Progressive Radio Network. And let's get to it. Gloria, you're the host. Take it away.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to Left on Left, where the left critiques itself and laughs out loud to keep from crying. I'm Gloria Guillo, a former administrator in New York City government, an investigative journalist, vice chair at WBAI Radio, and a co-founder of Green Renaissance Sovereign Rights Movement, a group so left it's right on. I'm joined here today by a resident expert, Jeremy Kuzmarov. Jeremy is a professor at Tulsa Community College, historian, investigative journalist, and managing editor of Covert Action Magazine, an online magazine that focuses on CIA and deep state activity. Our producer and engineer is Jayme CheeseSlice. The opinions you hear are ours and not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. The content is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Listeners are encouraged to form their own opinions. Today's show is on the June 5th, 1968 assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. Jeremy points out in his article in Covert Action magazine that evidence implicates the CIA, the LAPD, FBI, and Mafia as plotters in an elaborate hit to prevent RFK from ever reaching the White House. While this killing is the subject of our discussion, it's important to note other grisly, public, extrajudicial killings done around this time, as they collectively illustrate how violent, murderous displays are used to achieve social engineering. Our audience may already be aware that the CIA has an entire manual devoted to training its agents in assassination techniques. Jeremy and I often discuss this 1950s book, which we both coincidentally studied prior to meeting at Covert Action magazine. How's that for having something in common? Ever since the Church Committee's 1970s report on the CIA hit daylight, we've understood that targets of the predator class can be eliminated successfully without much fanfare. There's the infamous heart attack gun that shoots poison ice and leaves no trace. There are drownings by expert swimmers, car and plane crashes using trucks, and now kill switches, turbo cancer set off through covert exposure to toxic, radioactive, and biological agents, routine surgeries gone wrong that unexpectedly become fatal. Then there are the questionable and convenient suicides, which include drug overdoses, hangings, and the infamous self-inflicted bullet in the head. However, in the case of journalist Gary Webb, one bullet wasn't enough. He shot himself twice in the head. Wrap your mind around that. Then there is Frank Olson, who reportedly threw himself out a closed hotel window on his shattering leap to death. Suicide killings are so commonplace that John McAfee tattooed himself with the phrase whacked and tweeted in 2019 that if I suicide myself, I didn't. I was whacked. He was found hanged in a Spanish prison while awaiting extradition to the United States. In pirate movies, we learned as kids, dead men tell no tales. Hey, by the way, neither of us are suicidal. So when we recall that there were no less than 5 bloody assassinations from 1963 to 68, we ask why their killings were done specifically in a way that elicits mass trauma. What does public trauma accomplish? For one, the spectacle of violence paralyzes movements and redirects rage into confusion or despair. Within this context, these murders are not merely about silencing individuals. They are about breaking the will of entire communities. The message is always clear. Challenge power, and the consequences will be public, brutal, and unforgivable. Yes, sadly, in the span of 7 years, the deep state robbed us of John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Fred Hampton, and Robert F. Kennedy. Let's recall that in the early 1960s, the United States was on the verge of multiple reckonings. The civil rights movement was evolving into a critique of capitalism and imperialism. Black liberation was becoming internationalist. Anti-war voices were converging with the demands for economic justice. And these political leaders were speaking in what the predator class considered subversive tones. They were questioning the CIA, advocating nuclear de-escalation, and acknowledging poverty as a systemic failure. And all 5 leaders were exceptionally highly principled communicators that united and energized people across party and racial lines, both young and old. As we often discuss on our show, unity is what the predator class fears most because our love for family, community, and country is a stake in their vampiric globalist heart. When divisive identity politics and oppression Olympic Games won't divide us, they shoot our leadership. Because emotional shock breaches our defenses, it's a sucker punch to the gut. Extreme violence naturally overrides our rational filters. It bypasses critical thinking and creates an emotional opening for manipulation, whether it's to mobilize, paralyze, or redirect us. Violent spectacles create a climate of fear, which can be used to justify surveillance, militarization, authoritarian policies, and the suspension of rights. But even more sinister is that violent spectacles desensitize us and engineer our apathy, because repeated exposure to trauma dulls our emotional response through overload. Additionally, while public attention is consumed by emotional spectacles, corruption, war crimes, and unpopular legislation can proceed without pushback in the background. Lastly, gory public executions and highly televised mass killings serve as ritualized assertions of power. They tell us without words, we control life and death. Watch and fear. Let's recall that Robert F. Kennedy had just won the California primary. He was poised to become the Democratic nominee for president. He was a man who had evolved from power to principle, who spoke of poverty, racial justice, and ending the war in Vietnam. And then, in the blink of a moment, he lay bleeding on the floor of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Another hope extinguished in full public view, because the goal was not just elimination, the goal was trauma. Shock paralyzes, grief fragments, fear teaches silence. And in that silence, the system resets. That's the genius of the operation. It doesn't require your belief, it only requires your exhaustion. Turn radicals into martyrs, movements into memorials, hope into nostalgia. It's not just the loss of a leader, it's the weaponized reminder of mortality and powerlessness. This remains the brilliance of the operation. It doesn't require you to believe the official story. It only requires you stop believing in change. It doesn't rely on public approval, only on exhaustion. And on this tragic anniversary like this, June 5th, we remember not just who died, but what died with them. And more importantly, who survived. Who still profits from this silence? Who ensures the next revolutionary dies before their second act? But this psyop only works if we remain asleep. Let's wake up and ask the right questions again. Not solely who shot the leader, but who profited when the crowd fell silent. Take it away, Jeremy.
I don't know what more to say. I mean, we can look into the specifics of the case of Robert Kennedy because we're approaching the anniversary. I think, yeah, the general phenomenon you point to is very significant for people to understand that this is kind of a ruling strategy, really a rule through violence and terror, and puncture the illusions of American democracy that is used to undergird the American empire and the this missionary zeal to export democracy. That's the kind of ideological veneer of the American empire. But if we look at American politics, really the country is not a functioning democracy, and political change occurs through violence, and it's engineered, as you point out, by the elites. And these assassinations, fit together of that decade. I mean, you can look at where we are now. Yeah, there was a liberal shift in the 60s. You had the significant social movements of that era. And Robert Kennedy was I mean, at his core, he was a political opportunist. If you look at his career, he was not a saint. He started out he was a supporter of Joseph McCarthy. He was a zealous Cold Warrior. When he was the Attorney General, he was running a lot of the U.S. foreign policy under his brother, and he was coordinating the Operation Mongoose in Cuba. And he was a zealous hawk on Vietnam. But he was, after his brother was assassinated, I mean, he was an opportunist politically. He saw and he was smart, and he saw where the winds were shifting. He saw the power of the social movements of the 60s, and the younger generation and the liberal shift. And so he shifted to adopting more liberal policy positions. And the student movements and counterculture felt they had a champion, in the '68 election when he challenged Hubert Humphrey with Johnson dropped out of the race because he was so unpopular because of Vietnam. Hubert Humphrey became the old guard, candidate, but he was linked with the Cold War. He had been an old style Cold Warrior who had purged leftists, back in his days in Minnesota. He had purged leftists and the Farmer Labor Party elements from the Democratic Party, and he'd used red baiting to advance his career. And then he was a hawk on Vietnam. But here was Kennedy, a younger man who had a lot of energy, and he was speaking the language of the youth counterculture and talking about ending the Vietnam War and fighting poverty. And he was going into areas of the country that most politicians wouldn't go. He was going into Appalachia and poor communities, and he could connect with the people there. And there was real hope that he was going to advance, Johnson's Great Society and adopt, more liberal policies that the young people hoped to address, economic inequality in the country. And then he was assassinated, and that kind of deflated. I think the student movements and counterculture lost hope in the system at that point. They saw power for what it was in America, and the left kind of the student counterculture kind of fragmented at that point. And you had these more radicalized factions like the Weather Underground that emerged, that were carrying out bombings across the United States, and that alienated the public. And there's suspicion of FBI provocateur and some pretty compelling evidence that some of those violent groups like Weather Underground were infiltrated by the FBI and intelligence agency to destroy the left. And I have an article coming out on the Symbionese Liberation Army, was a violent radical leftist group in San Francisco, but really it was a creation of the CIA to give a negative image of the left and destroy it. So, that goes with these assassinations, that the goal is to destroy those movements, destroy the idealism, destroy any hope of change in the system, and at the same time manufacture these ultra-violent fringe groups to further discredit political activism. And that leads us to where we are today, the complete destruction of the left, of idealism in politics, and just two corporate warmongering parties and a right-wing shift in politics. And no figure like a Robert Kennedy has emerged, really ever since to create some hope for change within the system, to channel progressive movements into a concrete political agenda. And instead we have two, as we've discussed on this show, two right-wing parties that have also adopted more and more, police state measures. As these phenomena you're describing, there are so many other manufactured incidents and spectacular violence that has shocked or numbed the public. Like we discussed, the Oklahoma City bombing is one example, or 9/11. And now we have, the Patriot Act, and, what America once was, and a country that cherishes, civil liberties, is lost in the process. And, right after Robert Kennedy was assassinated, there was emergency legislation that was passed to beef up police forces and police presence in the country, and passed legislation that was eroding civil liberties. So that assassination set things in motion. And, we can certainly discuss some of the details about the assassination and cover-up.
Yeah, could you go into the shooter and the whole history of how he might have been an MK Ultra victim? Can you go into that a little bit? Because
Absolutely.
some of the parallels are very similar to other executions that we've seen.
Yeah, and I would add an important point is that one reason an additional reason that they couldn't allow Robert Kennedy to live and become the president, because he was poised to become the next president. And he was going to reopen the investigation into the murder of John F. Kennedy, because he understood that there was a wider conspiracy, that the CIA was involved, that Lyndon Johnson and the Texas oil men were involved. He knew that. He knew the Warren Commission was a cover-up and a setup by Johnson and Hoover. And so he was going to reopen that investigation and expose the truth about the murder of his brother. And so he had to be silenced because of that, because that would have brought down some very powerful figures and implicated the intelligence agencies in the murder of a president. So they took him out, and then we'll have a show in July. They also set up Edward Kennedy. They had to make sure that Edward Kennedy would not become president. So they set him up in a Chappaquiddick incident, and we'll discuss the evidence in a show we plan in July about how Edward Kennedy was set up. And they may have also murdered John F. Kennedy Jr. To prevent any Kennedy from ever acceding to the White House. And I mean, personally, I don't think the Kennedy, I think there's some, in some circle, there's this effort to idealize the Kennedys. I mean, I don't think they were, model progressives necessarily, but they were more liberal than other leaders. But a lot of it has to do with covering up the JFK assassination and the criminal operation that was behind that, involving the CIA, to prevent any Kennedy. And we've seen how Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been smeared in the media, and his character has been assaulted. And he investigated, and that's a good bridge into discussing the RFK assassination, because RFK Jr., of all the children, and RFK Sr. had many children, but of all those kids, and there are a lot of Kennedy kids around, but RFK Jr. had been the one really to press forward for a reopening of the investigation, and to probe into the case, and to speak out publicly in defense of Sirhan Sirhan, who is the accused assassin. And RFK Jr. met with Sirhan in prison. And the evidence really is overwhelming that Sirhan Sirhan was set up as a patsy, like Lee Harvey Oswald. And some of the key evidence, so Sirhan Sirhan was this Jordanian living in California. He was a small guy, as far as his height and build. He was actually a jockey, and jockeys are small. And he fell off a horse and had some kind of injury. And it may have been through his horse racing that he came in touch, with some of these people in the MK Ultra orbit. But the evidence is overwhelming that he was not the killer. And just to sum up some of the key evidence.
Before you do that, Jeremy, just a couple of things. One, I just wanted to talk about John F. Kennedy Jr. and his plane crash. And I just like you to state that, what he was up for. We
plan on doing a whole show on that.
Well, just a quick word. I mean, he was up for senator, wasn't he? And he was competing against.
He had set up a magazine, George Magazine, that was probing into corruption and some of the nefarious activities like these assassinations that we're discussing of the CIA. And he was starting to build up his profile for a political run.
And who was his competition?
He was running for governor of New York, and then he was going to use that as a stepping stone to the presidency. And he had the Kennedy good looks and the magnetism and the money behind the family. Don't forget, this is a very wealthy family. I mean, I view it as, in a way, a kind of inter-elite rivalry. Like, I don't see the Kennedy as these great progressive champions, because John F. Kennedy, the person I see in American politics as a genuine anti-imperialist and progressive who wanted move toward peace with the Russians, was calling for the closure of American air bases, was Henry Wallace. He was Roosevelt's vice president when John F. Kennedy was a congressman, he mocked Wallace, never associated with his anti-imperialism, and he supported, American corporate expansion abroad, and he was a zealous Cold Warrior. That doesn't justify in any way his assassination.
But Jeremy,
and again, as I described, Robert was moving toward a more liberal position, channeling the energy of the youth.
And wasn't he up against Hillary Clinton?
Well, I don't think in that case Clinton was involved in the murder, but yes, John F. Kennedy Jr. was beginning to build his profile for a run for the presidency, possibly in 2004, when instead we got John Kerry, who was a very dull and weak candidate. So he could have very easily been elected. Again, the Kennedys have a certain charm and magnetism, good looks, and a liberal profile that makes them extremely appealing candidates. And we can discuss that case in broader depth in our July show.
Okay, and then if you could just walk us through that fateful day, what was Robert F. Kennedy doing? Who was in front of him? Who was behind him? Walk us through that. And then kind of bring into, what Sirhan did or didn't do. Thanks.
Okay, well, that was the day of the California primary, and Kennedy won the primary, which was a huge victory for his campaign. It was going to propel him to the nomination for the 1968 election at a time when there was, again, a huge youth an opposition movement against the Vietnam War, and he had repositioned himself from a hawk to a dove now against the Vietnam War, who was going to end it. So he gave a victory speech. Then he walked at the major hotel in outside Los Angeles. Then he walked toward the kitchen, and that's when he was shot. And Sirhan was there, and see, Sirhan fired 4 shots, although he only got away 2 in the direction of Kennedy. And it is possible he had a cap gun, because they said his gun sounded like caps and not necessarily a real gun. He was tackled by one of Kennedy's bodyguards, who's a former professional football player. So he only got 2 shots, 4 overall. I think 2 were toward the ceiling. But the scene of the killing had over 10 bullets, as many as 13 or maybe even more than 13. So right away, we know for a fact that there's more than one shooter. We also know that Kennedy was shot at close range behind the ear, and that Sirhan was in front of Kennedy at a certain distance. So the forensic evidence where Kennedy was shot once behind the ear, and that was the fatal bullet, and I think another bullet in the back. So Kennedy was shot 3 times. So if the fatal bullet is behind the ear and Sirhan's in front of Kennedy, and also he was at a certain distance, so the shots that struck Kennedy were from a very close range. So I'd have to go back over the evidence, but I'm not certain that it's possible even any of Sirhan's shots hit Kennedy. And very clearly, he was not the killer. I mean, again, we know for a fact that there's at least 2 shooters, because there's more bullets, and that the fatal bullet comes in from close range behind the ear. So the real assassin was close to him, and it could not have been Sirhan. So we have to rule him out as the killer. Now, investigations have revealed the likely killer, and this is what Robert Kennedy Jr. Believes, is a guy named Thane Eugene Cesar, who was a security guard who is found to have, who's now deceased, who is found to have worked for Lockheed Martin and a branch of Lockheed Martin that was connected with the CIA. Now, as far as Sirhan goes, people who interviewed him felt he had been under hypnosis and that he'd been programmed, that his answers it sounded like a robot. And also, he was oddly very, very calm when he was interrogated by the police after he was taken in. And he actually had no memory of shooting Kennedy. And it was uncovered that, that he, there was a set of triggers. It appeared that he was programmed to go there and shoot, possibly with a cap gun, as a diversion and a patsy, and that the key for him was a woman, like the trigger. When you're hypnotized, there's a trigger, something, a person you encounter or code word that puts you in this hypnotic state. And this was the trigger for Sirhan was a woman in a polka dot dress, who was identified as being on the scene of the assassination. There are various theories as to who this woman, as to her identity. One theory holds that her name was Patricia Elaine Neal, and this woman actually, ironically, married a man who was in the CIA, who had been a Korean War veteran. So that is thought to have been the trigger for Sirhan, because he was seen and he was behaving normally most of the night, but then when he met this woman, that was seemingly the trigger. And then she was identified running out of the building, out of the hotel, and she said something like, we shot Kennedy, and they ran into the night, her and an accomplice. So is believed to be part of this, elaborate intelligence operation. And, as far-fetched as it sounds, when you look into this stuff, we had an episode a few weeks ago on the Operation MK Ultra. They were actually programming people, experimenting under MK Ultra with methods of hypnotism to try and program people to carry out various acts, including assassinations. And Sirhan's behavior would seem to fit the model of somebody who was programmed. And this was the assessment of various psychologists who interviewed him in the years after the assassination, as well as journalists and authors who've investigated the case, because there are a fair number of good books now written on this topic, including one by Lisa Pease. And that is the conclusion they came to. And another thing is that his answers, sounded very robotic, and he found some writing. He put out these writings, anti-Kennedy writing, but it was all about the Palestinian conflict, and Kennedy had to die. But that wouldn't be a legitimate motive, because all the candidates at that time were pro-Israel. It's the climate surrounding that conflict is different from it is today. At that time, Israel was viewed as this kind of upstart young country, fighting for justice, and there had been wide support for Israel during the 6-Day War. And so all the Democratic Party candidates supported Israel unilaterally. So why would Sirhan target Kennedy uniquely in that field of Democratic Party candidates when they all favored Israel? And the statements he made, it just looked like it was programmed writing, something that was put out there to create this legend. As we've discussed on the show, the CIA will create legends of the patsies, like they did it for Lee Harvey Oswald, to make it seem like he was this pro-communist defector who was in this pro-Castro organization. And they even set it up so he would be arrested, so he would have his name in the papers and the media. So it's all part of a Psy-War operation to create an image of somebody. So I think they wanted to deliberately create this image of Sirhan as this militant, pro-Palestine guy who was anti-Israel and hated Kennedy for that reason. So they manufactured these writings under hypnosis, which were mostly incoherent, but mixed in the pro-Palestine and anti-Kennedy rhetoric. So I think that's part of the Psy-War, and to blame Sirhan. And the whole case was rigged. Even his lawyer, they gave him a defense lawyer who was like under indictment and was facing felony charges. And it appeared they blackmailed him. So he didn't properly defend Sirhan. And that was part of it. Sirhan never got a fair trial. There was never a fair police investigation. In fact, they destroyed, the LAPD destroyed thousands of documents before the trial that might have shed some light on the truth about what happened. So the complete cover up, and it continues to this day. When Kamala Harris was the AG in California, she made sure that the case was not reopened, and she made some public statements saying, "Oh, Sirhan, the evidence is overwhelming that Sirhan was the lone assassin." And you wonder why she was the person elevated in the Democratic Party.
Well, two things that are really hard to fudge is a coroner's report, okay, and then the second thing that's very hard to fudge are the ballistics. And I believe in this case, what you've written is that these things were also doctored. From what I recall reading, Sirhan was standing in front of him. Exit wounds from bullets are not really up for consideration. It's very clear where a bullet enters and a bullet exits. And according to what I had read, the exit wounds were in the front. So he was shot in the side and back, not in the front. And Sirhan was standing in the front.
Correct.
So whether or not Sirhan actually fired a lethal bullet or whether he was shooting blanks, there was some issues with missing, I believe, evidence in that was serious. And every police department, every FBI, every CIA, you go for the ballistics, you go for the entry and exit wounds. So this is extremely suspect when there's any fooling around with these things. So it's really hard to kill someone when the bullet comes out towards you and you're the shooter, as opposed to going from you into the person. So hey, something's wrong here.
Well, yeah, and when they're destroying evidence, when a police department is destroying evidence before a trial, when they're not allowing the autopsy in the trial, when the autopsy revealed what you're discussing, it contradicts the narrative and it exonerates Sirhan, but yet they're not allowing that autopsy report. And there was a high school student, Enyart, who was there, and Unsolved Mysteries, to its credit, that was a show that actually did on mainstream TV probe into some of these cases, in a real investigative way. And I remember watching an episode about this high school student. I think his name was Walter. I know his last name was Enyart. And he had a video that showed more than one shooter, and showed some of the reality of what went on. And the LAPD seized his camera and suppressed the video for decades. I think there still is a copy that may have been ultimately obtained only very recently. So the evidence is overwhelming that there's a cover-up in place here. And again, that cover-up continued to the present day. And I think Kamala Harris, and this is something we see in American politics, if you study it, that the people who help cover up the truth and protect the deep state or protect the criminal, the predator at the top, they constantly get promoted. And you wonder, how did Kamala Harris, nobody even voted for her in that primary, she got 1%, and yet she was the vice president and almost became a president. Well, she was the attorney general who quashed any reinvestigation into this case and publicly proclaimed Sirhan was guilty, even though, again, the evidence is in this case is extremely strong to show that he was set up as a patsy, that he was hypnotized, and that he appears to be entirely an innocent victim. Just like Lee Harvey Oswald, we can discuss the JFK assassination in depth in another program. The evidence is overwhelming that Lee Harvey Oswald was innocent. He was also, in his case, he was part of the intelligence. He was a CIA operative. They gave him a job at the Texas School Book Depository, but he was a witness placed Oswald in the second floor cafeteria drinking a Coke 5 minutes before the assassination and 2 minutes after the assassination. And it would have been impossible. How could he ran up in that time to the 6th floor, which was a lot of flights of stairs, carried out the shootings. And as it is, he was a very poor shot. It would require a master sniper. But in the JFK case, we also know that Kennedy was shot from the front. The forensic evidence had the bullets from the front, even the bullet holes in the limo. And there are many more shots than were fired from the Texas School Book Depository. And Oswald, the witnesses placed him in a place that he could not have been the shooter. And they also framed him for the murder of police officer J.D. Tippit. So there are striking parallels. If you look at the Kennedy assassination, if you look at the Robert Kennedy assassination, John, Robert, look at the Martin Luther King assassination. That was also a frame job. James Earl Ray was set up as the patsy. And just the forensic evidence made clear in that case, James Earl Ray would have to hang out of a window and somehow shot on the side while hanging with his foot hanging out of the window, a pinpoint shot at a significant distance. When Ray also was very poor, they said he knew nothing about guns and he was not a good sniper. These only like the top snipers in the world could have carried out these killings. So just that alone, let alone all the other evidence, which we don't have time to dissect right now, but just some basic evidence makes clear that these people were set up and that the official story was false, and that these were state orchestrated killings of liberal figures, and it had a huge effect in shaping the rightward trajectory and the movement toward a fascistic state that a lot of people are very distressed about today under Trump, with the kidnapping of students, sending them to prisons in El Salvador. Immigrants, many may have legal status, are being kidnapped, let alone the censorship we've seen over the COVID-19, how police are more like armies in our cities, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a different America, a more authoritarian, fascistic America, not the one envisioned by the American founding fathers. And these assassinations have put us, sadly, to where we are today. So, yeah, we have to understand these phenomenon, and it's important to exonerate the people and to teach young people the right history about how the government can manipulate events and carry out political assassinations. And it also undermined the legitimacy of the American overseas empire, that this is not a righteous cause to spread democracy when we don't have a successful democracy here. We have more of a fascistic state here in the way that sadly exists in other countries as well.
True. It's really gone down a dark way. The murder of Robert F. Kennedy ushered in definitely a new period. I believe he was one of the latest in the string of these murders. Maybe I think Fred Hampton was after him, but they were all, I think that might have been the last one. They really are chilling and disorienting. And it's very important for people to focus on who's behind these things, because what you've pointed out, and in all of these executions, extrajudicial executions, is that it takes a very sophisticated organization to coordinate all of these pieces and to make it work. You have to have the staff on the ground, you have to have the staff in the hospital, you have to have the staff in the coroner's office, you have to have you really need to have fingers in every part of this to make it work. And we do these shows on these assassinations, and every time YouTube will put up a disclaimer explaining that what we've just said is not the official narrative, that Sirhan did, I expect to see that, the same way I've seen on the other shows, that Sirhan was the killer and case closed. And it's really interesting how YouTube has this need to always maintain the prevailing narrative, irregardless of any controversy that's out there that's based on fact. So,
Well, and I'm a professional historian, and I think there's been a miserable failure of the academic profession to tell the truth and expose. There are a lot of good books out there. However, they tend to be off the beat presses, and they're not academic historians writing them who work in the academy, the Ivy League or other universities. So students aren't getting the truth in their coursework, and often those Ivy League or academic historians malign those researchers who probe into these cases as conspiracy theorists, and that's in a negative way, and they just dismiss them. And that occurred. William Pepper was a incredible lawyer who was the King family lawyer, and he spent years doing incredible research, tracking down witnesses, doing what a real investigator does, which is not easy work. Tracking witnesses down, and these are decades-old crimes, finding people, getting them to speak on the record, digging into some archives, old police files, etc. And he uncovered a great amount to help us better understand the King assassination and the conspiracy behind it and the role of the FBI. He was also involved in investigating the Robert Kennedy assassination. But when he recently passed away, the New York Times wrote an obituary attacking him and just maligning him as a conspiracy theorist. And and then the time recently, with the recently disclosed, JFK documents, there was an article and a quote of a Harvard professor, Frederick Logeval, who's supposedly this distinguished Cold War historian. And he said, "Oh, we know the truth about the Kennedy assassination already. Oswald was the lone assassin, and these conspiracy theorists are ridiculous." And this is a Harvard professor, so people listened to him. And he functioned as a kind of gatekeeper in the academy. And I think that's very important in perpetuating these mythologies and maligning investigators. But I've done a lot of reading of books in the last several years on the Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy, Martin Luther King assassinations, and they're really great books where they unearth a lot of good information. In some cases, they don't know exactly. Like with John F. Kennedy, we basically know the picture, based on those stories, those books, that research, what happened. Of course, there's still certain question marks, but these are really earnest investigative effort, and they've unearthed a tremendous amount of information. But it's not reaching the mainstream because you have these academic gatekeepers, you have these media gatekeepers, you have the phenomenon you're describing in YouTube, and you have this attempt to malign real investigators as conspiracy theorists. And that's part of the Psy-War operation of the CIA, to malign investigators as conspiracy theorists, to conceive of that as a negative term. So that's what we're fighting against. But if you talk to the average person, I think many people are very suspicious about these assassinations. They're suspicious about the government. They're willing to look at the evidence. So I think there's a reckoning to be had in our society that we can't allow this to continuously go on, and that America was set up as a democracy, and we should try and get the country to live up to that ideal. Because the behavior here is more that of authoritarian and fascist states.
Well, also we've discussed on other episodes on how the concept of truther and the concept of anti-imperialist are put in separate categories. On the so-called right, you have the truthers, Libertarian Party, perhaps some, Republicans, some conservatives. And then you have the left looking at the truthers and saying, "Oh, you guys are just conspiracy theorists," and negating the whole thing. And then on the truther side, the left, the anti-imperialist left, will talk about the takeover of countries for the oil barons, for the agriculture, big agriculture and things like that, the Rockefellers, and all of that. So you have this separation, and the truthers will look at these anti-imperialists as less than and say, oh, you guys are just socialists or communists, and they'll dismiss that. So one of the things that we've talked about is uniting these groups into a cohesive movement where we're looking at everything the United States does, both domestic and foreign. And, something that erodes sovereignty, something that erodes rights, something that is against the American public and the taxpayer is something that we all should focus on and not just stay in our silos and, not look. So, we have some opportunities with the audience that we have with WBAI and the Progressive Radio Network. We have some opportunity to reach out to the left, so to speak, and hope that they can look more at these truther type domestic issues and focus on them, because we really need, a wide base and not just, two separate camps.
Well, I think one way to look at some things is that these assassinations in some way reflect the corrupting effects of U.S. Imperialism, because there's more and more evidence. There's a new book I've just been reading that points to the role played by Edward Lansdale as a key figure in helping to coordinate the JFK assassination with Lyndon Johnson and other elements of the CIA and FBI. But Lansdale appeared the key quarterback, and he was identified by 4 different people in a photo at Dealey Plaza where Kennedy was assassinated, walking away just 10 minutes after Kennedy was assassinated. And Lansdale was a key overseas operator of the U.S. empire in Southeast Asia. He was sent to the Philippines to create a pro-American regime that would allow U.S. military bases and stamp out the left-wing Huck movement. And that's where he developed his expertise in assassination. And, he would carry out all kinds of assassinations and grim tactics in running a counterinsurgency operation. And then he was sent to Vietnam in the 1950s to engineer a regime in South Vietnam. And he ran a counterinsurgency operation to target the Viet Minh, who had fought against the French and were now against the American president and the client leader the U.S. had tried to install in South Vietnam. And he ran an assassination program that morphed into the Operation Phoenix. So he was a key brainchild of that. And this book and a couple others show actually in the 40s, he gained access to Japanese stolen gold that they left in the Philippines at the end of World War II, and that was used to fund a lot of black operations. And then he's seen in Dealey Plaza 10 minutes after JFK was killed. So the techniques, the violent techniques that were used to forge the American overseas empire in Southeast Asia and try and access the resources of those countries, those same techniques came back home, and it's the same people doing the same things overseas. Now they're doing, and Lansdale was a master at regime change. He was a key coordinator of regime change operation in the Cold War, and this was just a new mission for him. And he had a falling out with Kennedy, in part because Kennedy green-lighted the overthrow of the U.S. client leader in South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, who was Lansdale had helped to build Diem's regime and was a close friend of Diem. And Lansdale was quoted somewhere saying, "You never kill your friends," because Diem was murdered in this CIA-backed coup, and Kennedy greenlighted the coup. So he had a vendetta against John Kennedy, and also he had fallen out with Kennedy. He was a key operator in the Kennedy administration, covert operator, but he was on the outs after the Diem coup. And then under Lyndon Johnson, he got, again, a top position in Vietnam. So this was just more business for him, doing what he was doing in Philippines, Vietnam. Now he's coordinating a regime change coup in the United States. It's natural. He's an expert at that, but that expertise was developed in the overseas empire. So I think that the people on the left or any progressive can underscore that these methods of empire have corrupted our democracy and are being used here at home for regime change and all kinds of other manipulations. And that was a core point of the Anti-Imperialist League. In a previous episode, we advocated for formation of a new anti-imperialist league based on the model of the late 19th century, early 20th century anti-imperialist league that was supported by Mark Twain and other luminaries of the time. And that was a core point that they made, that if the United States pursued an overseas empire, it would corrupt and destroy our democracy. And I think Lansdale's involvement in the Kennedy regime change coup operation is a key example of what they have warned about. So I think that's something we can underscore and may bridge those communities you're talking about together, because this is a cancer to all of us, all Americans.
One of the things that I had researched a little bit before this article was the role of the Dulles brothers. And they weren't involved in Robert F. Kennedy's murder, per se. But
No, they were dead by then.
excuse me?
They had died by then.
Yeah, they weren't involved in that. But they had put together this whole CIA organization, which could act on itself. I mean, it was already, they had the training, they had the manuals, they had the infrastructure, they had this sense of that improprietary things were okay. They could do whatever they want. And so these things were set in place, I would say, by Dulles. He was extremely, would you agree with that Dulles had a big role in this whole way that the CIA was organized? I mean, when we've done shows actually with Covert Action Magazine, we talk about the initial view of the CIA. And I just think we should come back to that for a second. When the CIA was created, it was really an intelligence gathering strategy, which was the Office of Strategic Affairs. So it was to really bring these documents and this intelligence to sitting presidents, so they would understand what is going on in other countries, so that they could better plan their foreign policies. And that was the goal. It was completely transformed into something completely different. And I think you would agree that Dulles was that architect. And it changed into covert actions and actually changing what goes on in other countries. And that line between what goes on exterior to the United States and interior, there was this, firm line between the FBI and the CIA. That line doesn't exist anymore. There's no compunction against the CIA turning on Americans. And there's no compunction about it crossing into activities that the FBI does, or vice versa, or infiltrating the FBI, infiltrating police forces. That's not supposed to happen. The CIA is not supposed to step into the LAPD and say, okay, you can't say this, you can say that, give us the ballistics, give us the coroner's report, give us, all of this information, and we're going to just dispose of it. But that's what's happened. Everything that it wasn't supposed to be, it has become.
Well, I think you have to more broadly understand, this is something Philip Agee pointed out, the CIA whistleblower, that the CIA was an instrument of the banking elite. And, so if you're talking about the financial interests and oligarchy that has run the United States, according to FDR, since the days of Andrew Jackson, if not before. So you really, have to look more at the CIA as an instrument of policy rather than the creator of the policy. So I think that's very important. The CIA was set up. I mean, if you're talking about the Dulles brothers, they work for Wall Street. They were corporate lawyers on Wall Street. They were involved with investment houses that actually, financed and bankrolled Hitler and the Nazi war machine, and that had major overseas financial investments. And that's one reason they were such gung-ho Cold Warriors, because the communist nationalization policy threatened the profits they could make all around the world. Their uncle was Robert Lansing, was a Secretary of State, and he was put in by Woodrow Wilson. The Secretary of State when World War I started was William Jennings Bryan, who had been the founder or leader in the Populist Party, which was a third party that was trying to rein in Wall Street banks. And he was against a loan that J.P. Morgan was trying to give to Britain and France, because he said that would put the U.S. on the side and the neutrality policy, and the European would demand, Morgan would want repayment of his loan, and the U.S. would have to invest to ensure a British and French victory in World War I. So Lansing green-lighted that loan. Wilson fired Bryan, put in Lansing, who was pro-Wall Street, and he was the uncle of John Foster and Allen Dulles, and Allen was the head of the CIA. So if you're going to talk about the significance of the Dulles brothers, you have to also underscore that they are tools of the Wall Street gang, the Wall Street banking elite, and those are the ones that drive this aggressive U.S. foreign policy and use the CIA to carry out its dirty work, and that includes domestically. Increasingly, as we've been discussing, they've warped democracy, and they have to ensure that their interests prevail, not only overseas, but also at home. And that's why we see parallel methods being used both overseas, whether it's assassination, regime change, and cover-up like you're describing. Yeah, the CIA is micromanaging the police investigation and overseeing the trial to make sure it's not a fair trial, and the evidence doesn't come to light that would show why they're flawed and that convicts the patsy. So I agree with you on that. But yeah, I think you have to look at the CIA as an instrument of the banking elite, and that's the real evil that's controlling that built up the CIA and the way it's developed. And they fund the Council on Foreign Relations, which has propaganda initiatives to try and convince the public that U.S. foreign policies are carried out for righteous reasons. At the end of the day, it's this banking elite,
Well, thank you for making that really clear, abundantly clear for our audience. And also, I just want to correct, it's the Office of Strategic Services was the precursor to the CIA. I just want to restate this, but this PSYOP only works. This is the graphic killings. It only works if we remain asleep. Let's wake up and ask the right questions again. Not solely who shot the leader, but who profited when the crowd fell silent. So I think Jeremy has really brought us back to who profited. Yes, it is the predator class. It is the bankers. It is them. Okay, well, please, we're going to wrap it up. Please tell our audience how they can follow your important work, Jeremy, and financially support your efforts.
Please follow my work at Covert Action Magazine and become a subscriber, and also my Substack, Too Hot for the Mainstream. You can become a paid subscriber for simply $5 per month.
And LOL now has a Substack, and you can donate to that too if you'd like. We'd love that. So this wraps up our show for today. This is Left on Left. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined here by Professor Jeremy Kuzmarov. Remember to like, donate, and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week.
All right. Very good, guys.
Thanks,
So
guys.
Thanks, James.
Another one in the book. And I'll get the editing on that for next week on the radio.
I've got to run, but Gloria, we
Same.
can talk about some things in the next few days.
Sounds good.
And thanks,
All right.
Jamie. Thanks,
Good,
for
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jeremy.
Okay. See you guys soon.
And thanks to everybody at home who watched this episode. And you can also make sure to catch us on the radio. And if you can, leave feedback with the stations. Oops. Hit the wrong button there. Yeah, if you can and you listen to the show on WBAI, the Pacific Radio Network, go ahead and leave feedback with them. Tell them you like the show. It's helps us, so we want to try to stay on the air there. But thanks for watching, and we'll be back next week with another episode. Have a great weekend, everybody. Bye-bye.